This is our first session on Galatians 4:8-11, and it would be helpful perhaps before I read it to look at the last verse of the preceding paragraph. Because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave. That's going to be relevant. You're a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. And here's the next unit. But formerly, not knowing God, you were enslaved. So he's going back to describe what they were saved from and the incomprehensible move they're making, having become sons of God through faith. It seems that they would return to slavery. So let's read this. But formerly, not knowing God, you were enslaved to those that are by nature not God's. Come back to that and ask what that refers to. But now, knowing God, or rather being known by God, how can you, which means it is incomprehensible. It's beyond all reason. It's crazy. How can you turn back again to the weak and poor elementary principles whose slaves you want to be once more? Now, we saw that term, elementary principles, in the preceding section, right? Right here in the preceding paragraph. Here's the context for it. I mean that the heir, as long as he is a child, is no different from a slave, though he is the Lord of everything, but he's under stewards and household managers until the date set by the father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were enslaved under the elemental principles of the world. Now, I argued that this right here is a reference back to what we had seen earlier, namely that the law held us captive and was a kind of guardian or steward or household manager for us until Christ came. So here's the picture of that in the preceding section. Now, before faith came, that is, before Christ came, in whom we have explicit faith now, before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming of faith would be revealed. So then the law was our guardian until Christ came in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under the guardian. We're not slaves anymore, or like slaves. For in Christ Jesus, you are all sons of God through faith. And so in the next unit, he's referring to that same reality, only he's calling the law elementary principles of the world. And I'm going to suggest and did suggest that the reason he adds this of the world to elementary principles is because the ABCs of the law are no better than the ABCs of your former pagan idolatry if you trust in the law as a way to get right with God. That's what your situation was. It's not that anymore. And so now you know God, you're known by God. How can you turn back again to these weak and elementary principles? And I'm thinking that means, verse 10, you observe days, months, seasons, years. So he's interpreting these elementary principles here as the basic ABCs of the Jewish law. Now these, you were enslaved by those that are by nature no gods. Most of the Galatians were indeed Gentiles. They had been enslaved to pagan idolatry. Now they've been rescued, but along have come this sectarian group from Jerusalem that's saying, look, if you want to be real Christians, if you want to get truly right with God, You have to practice circumcision and the ABCs of the law. And Paul is saying those elementary principles basically put you back where you were in slavery to your former gods. It's a pretty radical statement that the actual Old Testament law, which is good in itself, would be classed with these things that by nature are no gods, because if you rely upon them, they are useless for you. So here's the summary that I see of the argument in this unit. So the first statement is what you were before. You were enslaved when you didn't know God. You were enslaved to those things that are by nature no gods. That would be, for the Gentiles, it would be idolatry and pagan religion. And for the Jews who did not come to faith in Christ or the promise of Christ, were enslaved to the ABCs. Both are of the law. Both are elementary principles. Now, he says, you do know God, or better, are known by God, so it is incomprehensible that you would turn back again to the poor elementary principles of the law, whose slaves you want to be once more. And then he defines what he means by the elementary principles with some examples here. And if you look at Leviticus, 23, the entire chapter gives you the lists of the feasts like first fruits and Passover and a Feast of Weeks and Feast of Trumpets and Day of Atonement, Feast of Booths, all these feasts that you're saying, look, if you want to be truly right with God, you want to be bona fide Christians, heirs of Abraham, you keep the elemental things of the law. And then Paul draws this fearful conclusion. I am afraid that I have labored over you in vain, which means you may not even be Christians. Pretty scary statement, right? You may not even be Christians. And he had said that at the beginning of the chapter. He's circling back with the same shock that he expressed when he said, I'm baffled over you, Christians. Let me ask you only this. Did you receive the Spirit by works of law? Answered, no. You received it by hearing with faith. Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected? Are you turning back to the flesh, that is, your own reliance upon law-keeping? Did you suffer so many things in vain? If indeed it is in vain, he doesn't know whether he has labored over them in vain, as he says here. I'm afraid that I've labored over you in vain. So we have several other things we need to focus on before we leave these verses. We need to talk about how does knowing God relate to being known by God? At least that, and probably a few other things as well. But this appears to be Paul's heart cry. It just can't be, can it? Don't you see what you're doing? Don't you see what glorious truth you are forsaking? In Christ Jesus, you are all sons of God through faith. 3:26 or 4:7. Because you are sons of God. God sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, you are no longer a slave, you are a son. If a son, then an heir. How can you, turn back to reliance upon law, which is no better than your former pagan idolatry?